At precisely 11 p.m. every night, my wife begins to cry, her muffled sobs echoing through the thin walls of our modest home, a haunting serenade that's become my grim lullaby. It started 3 months ago, just days after she returned from her mother's funeral, leaving behind not just a whisper of grief but something far more unsettling, something I'd come to fear in the quiet hours when darkness envelops our lives. At first, I thought it was just the weight of her loss, an understandable expression of sorrow that would eventually fade away as time offered its familiar comfort, but as the nights dragged on, her tears became a source of unease, filling the air with a strange, suffocating tension that made my heart pound and sleep impossible. I tried to console her, offering words of love and support, but she would only shake her head, her eyes downcast as if the very act of looking at me was too much to bear. Some nights, I would sit up in bed, listening to the soft, desperate whimpers that clawed at my insides, feeling helpless but not willing to intrude upon her grief. Yet deep down, an instinct told me something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the sadness, it was the unmistakable feeling that her sorrow was fueled by something more than memories and loss. One evening, driven by concern and fear, I mustered the courage to enter the dimly lit room where my wife sat, the faint glow of the clock casting morose shadows across her face, and as I pulled her into a tentative embrace, her sobs became sharp and jagged, transforming into gasps as though each breath was ripped from her chest. She whispered a name between tears, Lila, and I froze, recognizing it as her younger sister who died tragically in a car accident years prior, a pain buried beneath layers of familial duty and unspoken words. As I tried to scratch the surface of her grief, she suddenly recoiled, her gaze wide and wild, filled with a terror I hadn't seen before, and she uttered a chilling phrase that sent chills cascading down my spine. "She's calling for me." The statement hung heavily in the air, and my rational mind scurried to dismiss the idea, attributing it to emotional turmoil. But that night I found little solace in slumber, instead lying awake with dread pooling in my stomach, plagued by thoughts of what she might mean, whether Lila's soul hungered for her, or if there was something lurking on the edge of our lives. The following nights were even worse, the crying evolving into a haunting melody, an intimate lamenting fused with an otherworldly cadence that danced around the edges of my consciousness. I began to research, combing through articles and forums, digging up folklore about spirits and the connections we share, and my obsession grew until I made a discovery. Often, it is said, the departed return to those who grieve them, trying to take them away. Desperation washed over me, and I sought out help. Psychics, mediums, anyone who might make sense of my wife's nightly torment. One evening, I brought a local medium home, a vivacious woman with eerily sharp features who waved her hands as if conjuring spirits from the depths of the shadows. My wife sat on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the floor while the medium began the ritual, lighting candles and whispering secrets known only to the unseen. Within moments, the room felt stifling, tension thickening like fog, and then, to my horror, my wife began to cry again, but this time, her sobs morphed into pleading wails that were an echo of rage, confusion, and fear. The medium's demeanor shifted to one of alarm as if she sensed an uninvited presence in the room. With shaking hands, she asked what I had unleashed by summoning her sister, but I was oblivious, taking her words as hints of superstition. Then, inexplicably, the medium recoiled as if slapped, her voice trembling as she whispered, "There's something else here, something she's unaware of." And before I could ask for clarification, my wife burst free from the couch, her eyes wide and unrecognizable, fractured by shadows that danced behind her gaze. As she screamed Lila's name, mingling the past with the present, the lights flickered as if the very house lamented the souls trapped in its walls, and amidst it all, the medium faded into fear, becoming an unwitting prisoner of our haunting. I had no choice but to intervene, grasping my wife's shoulders in a desperate bid to bring her back into this reality, and with a frantic jerk, I pulled her into me, whispering reassurances. Yet within seconds, her anguished cries turned into a sound of sheer terror, and she began to shake violently as her body fought against something invisible, something rooted deep within her that had awoken that night. Against my better judgment, I plunged into the murky depths of our past, uncovering family secrets and whispered fears until finally, I stumbled across a worn journal that detailed Lila's tragic life. It contained tales of a darkness that followed her, a bitterness that seeped into her very essence before her untimely end, and in those words, I found the truth, a binding curse meant to lead through bloodlines, to drown the living in the desolation left behind by the dead. As the hour approached 11 p.m. again, dread coiling around my throat, I felt the tremors begin in my wife's body, the weeping manifesting anew, and this time, I feared for my life as well as hers. Instead of words, I gathered every ounce of love I could muster and pressed tightly against her, shutting my eyes against the encroaching horror of that inevitable witching hour, hoping to stave off my impending fate. In that moment, I knew Lila's spirit didn't merely seek to contact us but demanded revenge, her cries ripping through the fabric of our existence, and as I braced for the relentless vortex of rage and sorrow to engulf us, the last flicker of light succumbed to the darkness, leaving only the sound of my wife's cries, echoing in a way that felt all too real, an anguished plea that whispered from the depths of despair, forever ringing in my ears. And that's when I understood, sometimes, the dead don't just visit, sometimes, they come to collect.
When I helped a coworker achieve their goals, I didn't expect it would lead to something like this. It all started innocently enough in our corporate office, where I worked as a mid-level analyst at a finance firm. My coworker, James, was someone I had frequent interactions with. He was ambitious and driven but often struggled to navigate the political dynamics in the office. He confided in me one day about his career aspirations, revealing his desire to climb the corporate ladder, but he felt he lacked the charm and connections necessary to make it happen. I remember feeling compelled to help him. After all, we weren't just colleagues, we spent countless hours side by side during the grueling monthly reports. I offered to be his sounding board, and together, we devised a plan that involved networking events, professional development courses, and one-on-one sessions to polish his presentation skills. Over the next several months, we worked tirelessly, and I watched him transform from a timid, reserved worker into a charismatic, confident professional. He started attending these networking events, and I went with him whenever I could. By the end of it, he'd earned several new connections, and I could see in his eyes the belief that he could finally achieve his dreams. Yet, amidst this whirlwind of optimism, I couldn't shake the sensation that something wasn't right. The more he prospered, the more distant he grew. I had thought our bond was strengthening, but he began to leave me behind like a shadow, the late-night brainstorming sessions replaced by unscheduled meetings, and soon I was just an afterthought. It hurt, but I brushed it off. After a while, he landed a huge promotion and suddenly he was sitting at the big table in the conference room, surrounded by a new crowd of colleagues. It stung when he didn't even acknowledge me during the celebration. But I convinced myself it was worth it. Helping someone else achieve their dreams always seemed gratifying, and at least he was finally getting the recognition he deserved. One evening, late at work while everyone else had left, I was grinding through reports, surprised when James walked in. He looked different, though, not just because he was in a stylish suit now. There was a strange intensity in his gaze. He approached me, and to my astonishment, he actually thanked me for my help on his journey. He explained how he had applied everything we had discussed, how each piece of advice had propelled him, and how he had finally landed the position he'd always dreamed of. It felt good until he asked to meet later that night after exploring our next steps. I agreed, thinking it was a friendly gesture. We ended up in a dimly lit bar, where he told me about his new responsibilities, and then he leaned in closer, whispering that there was something I needed to understand about corporate success. It wasn't just about networking or skill, it was about sacrifice. He got this glint in his eye, and I couldn't pinpoint what it was, a kind of madness or maybe ambition so fierce it had morphed into something grotesque. Then he took out his phone and showed me a picture of our boss, barefoot on a beach, laughing with friends. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "What's this supposed to mean?" I asked. He smirked, eyeing me as if I were an idiot. He whispered something that sent a chill down my spine. "You have to be willing to do what others won't." I felt queasy as he continued. He spoke about ambition, power, and how it sometimes meant making uncomfortable choices. I laughed nervously, but his expression didn't change. I could feel the gravity of his words, something dreadful hanging in the air, but I didn't know what to say to ground the moment. When he mentioned leaving our boss out of the loop on crucial decisions, my heart raced. Was he suggesting sabotage? It felt insane, yet there I was, listening to him with a mixture of concern and sick intrigue, unsure of how I had gone from being his mentor to becoming part of some dark scheme. He seemed to enjoy my discomfort, it fed him. A week later, he continued down his path of conniving success, and little by little, I noticed changes in the office. James became increasingly ruthless, outmaneuvering colleagues, feeding them half-truths to advance himself, and it made me feel complicit. Every time he chatted with me, I wondered if he could sense my unease. I tried to distance myself from our conversations, but he brushed me off, insisting I was simply uneasy about my own stagnancy while he soared ahead. The night he called me to his office, I felt dread wash over me. He had a proposal: join him in an unethical financial maneuver. It was dry, corporate lingo for what was essentially a scheme to leverage our boss's trust against him. I thought I must be misunderstanding the gravity of it, yet he laid out the plan with fervor, detailing how we could manipulate the numbers just a little here and there to maximize profits, all while funneling some cash into discrete accounts. My blood ran cold. I shook my head vehemently, telling him this was wrong, that I wouldn't be part of this. His countenance shifted dramatically, the familiar charm morphed into something sinister. This is how the game is played. If you're not in, you're out. He leaned in close, every word laced with danger. I helped you, and now it's your turn to help me. I left the meeting terrified, and every day thereafter felt like a tightening noose around my neck. He would stop by my desk, always with an innocuous comment that turned insidious with every passing moment. Days turned into weeks, and I could feel the weight of my silence crushing me. James's decisions became a cacophony in my head. Each unethical step he took echoed through our office, and I was increasingly frightened by my own complicity in this nightmare. I realized I had helped him achieve not just his goals, but something wicked that was spiraling out of control. When I finally confronted him about it, I was met with a twisted smile. "You should thank me for the push. It's time for you to embrace this," he said, almost playfully. I tried to explain that I wouldn't be part of this, but he cut me off. "You already are. You always have been." And just like that, my world began to fracture. My colleagues whispered, conversations stopped when I entered the room, and I felt their disdain, as if they too recognized the darkness looming in our office. People were laying blame. Did they know? Was he turning them against me? I started receiving ominous messages late at night, and irregular knocks on my door became less vague. My nightmare continued to spiral until I stumbled upon a horrifying discovery. A closed-door meeting where James spoke about me, called me a traitor, sowing distrust among our team. I was no longer just a shadow in his rising career, I had become an enemy. Everything culminated when I received an anonymous email containing a recording of that fateful conversation from the bar, the proposal to join him in his dark path, like a ghost haunting my conscience. I shared it with HR, feeling a wave of sick satisfaction. James was summoned, only to emerge looking smug, always thinking he'd find a way to manipulate the truth. But once the recording played, the room fell silent, the laughter and camaraderie shattered like glass. It was his downfall, yet also mine, as I felt the chains of my own inaction weigh heavily on my heart. James was let go, but there was no triumph in it for me. I left the office that day with more scars than victory, feeling the weight of every shattered aspiration he had twisted to his own advantage. In hindsight, I should have known better. Helping someone achieve their goals can illuminate the worst sides of ambition, and it should serve as a warning that sometimes those goals come at a price, one that's rarely worth paying. So today, I work in a different firm, trying to rebuild my career and reputation. I often ask myself, what does it truly cost to help someone achieve their dream? If the world of ambition is riddled with shadows, guiding someone towards success may just leave you lost in the dark. How I faced my fear of public speaking, a journey of growth. I used to be terrified of public speaking. The mere thought of standing in front of an audience, knowing all eyes would be on me, made my palms sweat and my heart race. As a child, I had always been shy, the kind of person who preferred the safety of being invisible in a crowd. I never spoke up in class, and even at family gatherings, I would avoid the spotlight. But it wasn't until I entered college that I realized just how much this fear was holding me back. It was during my second year when I first had to give a presentation in front of my peers. The assignment was simple enough, just a 10-minute talk on a topic we were passionate about. I thought I could handle it. After all, I was passionate about the subject I had chosen. But as the day of the presentation drew closer, the fear took hold. I could feel the anxiety building up in my chest, the weight of it pressing down on me until I felt suffocated. I tried to prepare. I wrote out my notes, practiced in front of the mirror, and rehearsed the speech over and over. But nothing seemed to help. The morning of the presentation, I felt sick to my stomach. I barely slept the night before, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios, forgetting my lines, stumbling over my words, or worse, freezing completely in front of the entire class. As I stood in line waiting for my turn, I could see the other students confidently walking to the front, smiling, and delivering their speeches with ease. It was like they were born for this. And then there was me, shaking, heart pounding in my ears, hands clammy with sweat. When it was finally my turn, I walked to the front, my legs feeling like jelly beneath me. I tried to steady my breath, but it came out in shallow gasps. I looked at the audience, their eyes fixed on me, and suddenly, the room felt smaller, like I was trapped in a glass box. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. My mind went blank. The more I tried to force myself to speak, the harder it became. I could hear my voice cracking, and my hands began to tremble uncontrollably. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I stammered through a few sentences, my voice barely above a whisper, but I could see the confusion and impatience on my classmates' faces. My anxiety was spiraling out of control, and I could feel the sweat trickling down my back. I knew I was failing, and it was all I could do not to run out of the room and hide. Finally, the professor stepped in, gently asking if I needed a moment. Mortified, I nodded, and with what little dignity I had left, I retreated to my seat, my face burning with embarrassment. I don't remember much after that. I know I finished the presentation, but it felt like a blur. The rest of the class seemed to pass in slow motion, and I couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation that clung to me. I avoided eye contact with anyone, choosing instead to bury myself in my books. That day was a turning point for me. I knew I couldn't keep living like this, letting fear dictate my life. I had to face it head-on. The very next week, I signed up for a public speaking workshop. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for, but I knew I couldn't let that one experience define me. The workshop was held at a community center, and I remember walking and feeling completely out of my element. There were about a dozen people in the room, all different ages, all seemingly more confident than I was. The instructor, a man named Mark, had an air of authority about him but also a warmth that made the whole experience less intimidating. The first exercise we did was simply to introduce ourselves. It sounded easy enough, but when it was my turn, I almost choked. My throat went dry, and I could feel my face flush with heat. But this time, I made myself speak, even if it was barely audible. "Hi, I'm Name, and I'm here because I want to get better at public speaking," I said, the words coming out in a whisper. But Mark smiled, nodding as if my attempt was a victory in itself. The group clapped, and though I felt embarrassed, something inside me shifted. It was the first time I had spoken in front of a group since that disastrous presentation, and it wasn't as bad as I thought. Over the course of the next few weeks, I attended the workshops regularly. At first, I couldn't make it through a single exercise without feeling completely panicked, but little by little, I started to improve. The exercises varied from impromptu speeches to storytelling and even group discussions. Each time I spoke, I felt the fear lessen just a little bit. Mark taught us a technique that helped me more than anything, focusing on the message, not the fear. He told us that no one in the audience was there to watch us fail, they were there to hear what we had to say. It was a revelation. I had always believed that everyone was judging me, scrutinizing every flaw. But Mark made me realize that my audience was more interested in the message I was sharing than in how perfectly I delivered it. Slowly, I started to believe it. I began to reframe the way I saw public speaking. I wasn't standing in front of a crowd of strangers, I was sharing something important with people who might benefit from it. That shift in perspective made all the difference. By the end of the workshop, I was still nervous, but I wasn't paralyzed by fear anymore. I could stand in front of a group and deliver a speech without losing my breath. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. But my real test came when I was asked to give a speech at my college's annual conference. It was a big deal, and I had been selected to speak about a topic I had spent months researching. I knew I couldn't back out. The night before the speech, I felt the familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach, but I refused to let it control me. I had worked too hard to let this opportunity slip away. The next morning, as I stood backstage waiting for my turn, I took a deep breath, remembering Mark's advice. I focused on the message, not the fear. When I stepped out onto the stage, my heart was racing, but I was determined not to let it show. I looked out at the audience, my hands shaking slightly, but I started speaking. The words came out smoother than I expected, and soon, I was in a rhythm. I was nervous, yes, but I wasn't consumed by the fear. I was talking, not just to the audience, but with them. And when I finished, I was surprised to hear applause. Not just polite clapping, but genuine applause. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had truly faced my fear and conquered it. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of nervousness, a few stumbles, but it was the best I had ever done. That experience changed me. It didn't just teach me how to speak in front of people, it taught me that fear doesn't have to control you. It's okay to be scared, but you can't let it stop you from doing the things that matter. The journey wasn't easy, and there were plenty of setbacks along the way, but each small step forward made me stronger. Now, when I stand in front of an audience, I don't just see a crowd of people waiting for me to fail. I see an opportunity to share something important, to connect with others, and to be vulnerable in a way that can inspire growth, both for me and for the people listening. Fear is still there, but it doesn't own me anymore. I never wanted to share my story. In fact, I had promised myself that my struggles would remain buried, wrapped in the shadows of my mind. But the night I realized I wasn't alone changed everything, leaving me with an unsettling mix of relief and terror, a night that still haunts my dreams. It started as just another sleepless night, lying in bed while the silhouettes of my insecurities danced across my walls. My mental health had been crumbling, layer by layer, under the weight of anxiety and endless depression. I was convinced I had slipped into a world where no one could possibly understand the depths of my despair. So, like any night, I logged onto an online forum, desperate for solace among strangers. My fingers scrolled through post after post, each person echoing similar struggles, fatigue, emptiness, a numbness that spread through their bones like a poison. But one post captured my attention. A user named Lost Soul shared their own harrowing tale of feeling trapped in a house alone, battling demons of anxiety that screamed louder than any conversation. What struck me was how Lost Soul described a room in their home that had become a prison, a room filled with dark, suffocating memories, one they avoided at all costs. Word after word unraveled, each a mirror reflecting my own unbearable isolation. I felt an inexplicable tug of empathy for this stranger, a knot in the pit of my stomach growing tighter as I read. Our struggles felt intertwined, threads of a tapestry spun by shared pain. That night, I replied to Lost Soul, pouring out my own feelings, my own fears. To my shock, he responded. We began to write back and forth, messages filled with vulnerability. I had found a kindred spirit amid the sea of anonymity, a soul who understood that I wasn't alone in this fight. Over the following weeks, we built an unbreakable bond, sharing stories of our lives, our battles with mental health, and the sanity we believed we could never reclaim. Then came the day when Lost Soul suggested a face-to-face meeting. My heart raced. Did I really want to step out of my comfort zone? But something within me pushed me forward. The chance to connect with someone who knew my struggles was too precious to pass up. We arranged to meet in a local park, a neutral ground that felt safer for our first encounter. I arrived early, nerves tight in my chest, scanning the area for that familiar online persona. As the minutes crawled by, I thought about what I'd say, how I'd act. Every worst-case scenario played out in my mind. Finally, I spotted a figure approaching, a tall, lanky man with sunken eyes and a mop of dark hair. My heart sank as fear washed over me, but I forced a smile and waved. "You must be Lost Soul," I said, my voice wavering. He smiled in return, a weary but genuine smile. "And you must be me," he replied, stepping closer. We exchanged awkward pleasantries, but it quickly felt like we'd known each other for ages. We wandered the park, our conversation flowing, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He spoke about his struggles, the darkness that clouded his thoughts, and every detail resonated. It was a cathartic release, something I hadn't experienced in a long time. As twilight descended and the air cooled, the conversation turned more serious. "You know," he said, suddenly somber, "there's a whole community of us out there, battling demons we can't escape. But it's like we're all stuck in our own glass boxes, crying for help but too terrified to break free." His words struck me deeply, but I couldn't shake the feeling of foreboding settling in. It was a dark truth I had known but never dared to vocalize. The weight of our struggles felt so heavy, so pronounced, as if they had begun to manifest physically between us. We decided to sit on a park bench, beneath a flickering street lamp, and for the first time, I felt the chuckle of darkness creeping in. As we sat there, a strange chill took over the air, as if the world had shifted. My breath caught in my throat as I looked around. The park, usually alive with nightlife, felt eerily still. The chirping of crickets had died, and the warm colors of dusk drained away, leaving a foreboding gray. "You feel that?" I asked Lost Soul, my voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, he replied, eyes darting nervously. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. An unsettling sensation crept over me as if something, or someone, was lurking just out of sight. The shadows seemed to slink closer, caressing the edges of my vision. That's when we heard it, a low, muffled sobbing. It was faint at first but grew louder like a haunting melody rising into a crescendo. It echoed through the trees, wrapping around us, tugging at every fiber of my being. Both of us stood frozen, our shared vulnerability replaced with a primal fear. The sobbing had turned to wails, shattering the suffocating silence of the night. Where is that coming from? Lost Soul asked, panic creeping into his voice. Against every instinct, we walked closer toward the sound, drawn like moths to a flame. The moon cast a sickly glow over the park, illuminating a dark figure crouched next to a gnarled tree. As we approached, the wails morphed into frantic whispers. Help me, please, help. It called out, trembling and desperate. I felt my heart crash against my ribs, but curiosity pushed me closer. As we reached the figure, I was struck by a wave of realization. It was a girl, maybe our age, her eyes completely hollow, tangled hair hanging in matted strands. What happened? I breathed, kneeling down beside her, a glimmer of hope flickering in the depths of her despair. I can't escape. They're watching me, she gasped, frantic. Who's watching you? Lost Soul asked, his voice shaking. The girl looked at us, her eyes glistening but devoid of life. The ones inside, she whispered, her voice trembling. You can't let them take you. You have to run. I felt vertigo wash over me, an unnatural haze dimming my senses. That's when I heard a rustle, an unmistakable sound creeping through the darkness. Shadows whisked around the tree, undulating like smoke, spilling forth into the pale light. Panic surged within me. I turned to run, but Lost Soul stood frozen. Wait! He screamed, but it was too late. The dark tendrils had wrapped around us, dragging us into a suffocating embrace. An icy breath brushed against my neck as I struggled against the shadows, desperately clawing for freedom. All I could hear were their whispers, echoing our fears back to us, mocking our pain. I felt Lost Soul slip from my grasp, his terrified screams swallowed by the darkness. I couldn't tell if it was seconds or hours, but then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, the world around us shifting back into focus. I blinked, the park's vibrance returned, but it was empty. Lost Soul was gone. The girl was gone. I scrambled to my feet and called for him, but there was no answer. I stumbled through the empty paths and into the streets, left marooned in the haunting silence, alone amidst the shadows that had claimed my only connection. I returned home, the weight of despair heavier than ever, a gnawing emptiness settling in my chest. I searched for Lost Soul every day for weeks, convinced he would return to the forum, that maybe he had experienced something similar and would reach out. But his profile vanished, the account had been deleted. I hauntingly revisited that park, hoping against hope, but I never saw him or that girl again. The realization of solitude returned with a vengeance, reminding me of the shadows that hide in plain sight, waiting to claim the vulnerable. The haunting feeling remained, and as I scroll through social media, back to where I once found Lost Soul's post, I see the countless messages from others who feel alone. But now, the stories feel different. They echo something far more profound, far darker. It's not just the struggle, I believe now that it's something else. Keeping our pain hidden draws those shadows closer, whispering our fears until we become ensnared. I don't have any answers, I can't explain what happened that night, why Lost Soul and the girl disappeared. But I write this now, hoping others will see. If you relate to the darkness, remember this: don't let those shadows consume you, don't allow them to isolate your spirit. Speak. Share. Find those threads that bind us together in our pain, before it's too late. Because I keep wondering, what if it happened to you, too? What if you stepped into the darkness and never stepped back out? So, remember to reach out, even if it feels impenetrable, because what lurks behind the shroud of your mind may not just haunt you, it may await your silence, fiercely waiting to claim another lost soul. The day my pet taught me an important lesson. The day my pet taught me an important lesson. When I first got Chester, a scrappy little terrier mix with a knack for finding trouble, I had no idea how much my life was going to change. Chester was supposed to be a companion, something to keep me company in my small, creaky apartment. But it turned out that Chester was much more than a loyal pet, he was the best friend I'd ever had. He was quirky, with an intense look in his eyes that always seemed to know more than he let on. He had this way of staring at me like he was trying to communicate something I could never quite understand, like there was a secret he was desperate to share. I never thought much of it until that day, the day I realized Chester had been trying to teach me something all along. It started out like any other morning, the soft light creeping in through the window, illuminating the dust in the air, the quiet hum of the city outside. Chester was unusually restless, pacing around the room, sniffing the air with a strange intensity. I figured he'd heard something, a car backfiring, someone moving furniture in the apartment next door, but the way he looked at me was different. There was urgency in his eyes, almost a sense of fear, like he was trying to tell me something was wrong. I brushed it off, distracted by my own morning routine. But Chester wouldn't let up. He kept pacing, barking in short, sharp bursts that echoed through the quiet apartment. I knelt down, tried to calm him, but he was inconsolable, pulling at the hem of my pants with his teeth, tugging me toward the door with more force than I'd ever seen in him before. I tried to laugh it off, but there was something unsettling about it, something in the way he wouldn't look away, his eyes wide and pleading. All right, I sighed, grabbing his leash. Maybe he just needed some fresh air, I thought. I opened the door, and he shot out into the hallway, his little paws echoing on the floor, his body tense and ready. But as I followed him outside, I noticed something strange. The street was empty, unnaturally quiet for this time of day. There was an eerie stillness, the usual bustle and noise gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Chester tugged me down the street, pulling with a determination that I'd never seen before, guiding me down alleyways and side streets that I'd never taken. My heart started to race as I realized we were heading toward the old abandoned house at the edge of town, the one everyone said was haunted, the one parents warned their kids about. I'd never been near it before, never had a reason to, but now Chester seemed intent on leading me there, his nose low to the ground, his tail held high like he was on a mission. We reached the house, its windows dark and empty, the paint peeling off the walls like dead skin. Chester scratched at the door, whimpering softly, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to turn back, to take him home, but something held me there, some unspoken bond between us that compelled me to trust him. I opened the door, the old wood creaking beneath my fingers, and we stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay hanging heavy in the air. Chester led me through the dark, empty rooms, his paws silent on the floorboards as he guided me deeper into the house. I felt a growing unease, a sense of dread that built with each step, but I couldn't stop. Chester was on a mission, and I was trapped in his wake, following him down a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, we reached a door at the end of the hall, its surface scarred and battered, like someone had tried to claw their way through. Chester stopped, his eyes fixed on the door, his body tense and alert. He turned to me, and in that moment, I saw something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a warning, a plea. I swallowed, my hands shaking as I reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dimly lit room, empty except for a single, old chair in the center. The air was cold, colder than it had any right to be, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Chester stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the chair, and I realized he was trembling, his body tense with fear. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it, a faint, shadowy figure, barely visible, sitting in the chair, its head tilted toward us in a silent, unseeing gaze. My heart pounded in my chest as I stumbled backward, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, feel its cold, empty gaze boring into me. Chester let out a low growl, his hackles raised, his body pressed against my leg as if to protect me. I didn't understand, didn't know what he was trying to tell me, but I could feel his fear, feel his desperation to get me out of that room. I turned to leave, pulling Chester with me, but as I stepped into the hallway, I heard a voice, soft and whispery, like the wind passing through dead leaves. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, and I felt a chill settle over me, a coldness that seeped into my bones. I ran, pulling Chester along with me, my heart racing as we stumbled down the stairs and out into the blinding light of day. I didn't stop until we were back at home, safe within the familiar walls of our apartment, the quiet hum of the city outside a comforting reminder of normalcy. But Chester was different, quieter, more subdued. He didn't look at me the same way, didn't have that playful spark in his eyes. It was like something had changed between us, like he'd seen something I couldn't understand, something he could never unsee. For days, I tried to put it out of my mind, tried to convince myself that it was all a bad dream, a figment of my imagination. But every night, as I lay in bed, I could feel that cold gaze, that whisper of warning echoing in my mind. Chester stayed close to me, always watching, always alert, as if he knew that something had followed us back, something that was waiting, lurking in the shadows. And then, one night, I woke up to find him standing at the foot of the bed, his eyes fixed on something in the corner of the room, something I couldn't see. He let out a low growl, his body tense, his gaze unwavering. I sat up, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, nothing but shadows and silence. Chester looked at me, his eyes filled with a sadness I couldn't explain, a sadness that seemed to say goodbye. The next morning, he was gone. I searched everywhere, calling his name, tearing the apartment apart in a desperate frenzy, but he was nowhere to be found. It was like he'd vanished, like he'd been taken by something I couldn't understand. Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move on, tried to accept that Chester was gone. But every night, I could feel that cold presence, feel that whisper of warning echoing in my mind. And every night, I wondered if he'd left to protect me, if he'd sacrificed himself to keep me safe from something I couldn't see, something I couldn't fight. I don't know where he is, don't know if he's still out there, watching over me from some place beyond my understanding. But I know that he taught me an important lesson that day, that there are things in this world that we can't see, things that linger in the shadows, waiting, watching, and that sometimes, the ones we love will do anything to protect us from the darkness, even if it means leaving us behind. I never used to believe in emotions. To me, they were burdens, clutter in my already chaotic head. I had perfected the art of detachment, thinking it would make me invincible. I scoffed at the idea that vulnerability could ever lead to strength, but life has a funny way of throwing curveballs when you're least prepared. It started one rainy afternoon when I received a voicemail from my estranged father. You see, we hadn't spoken in years, a fact I wore like armor, believing it shielded me from pain. But when I heard his voice cracking through my phone like a fragile egg, all the walls I had built came tumbling down. He was calling from a hospital bed, a place I once thought I'd never be connected to in any way, asking for forgiveness. I felt a mixture of anger and pity, a toxic cocktail I didn't know how to handle. I thought about hanging up, about burying the feelings that rose up inside me like a tidal wave threatening to swallow me whole. Instead, I gripped the phone tighter, listening to each word that felt like knives. "I'm sorry I failed you," he said, his voice quaking. Something deep inside me stirred, something I had shoved down for so long that it felt foreign. I swallowed hard, trapped between the urge to scream and the urge to cry. I chose silence. Days passed, and I became increasingly obsessed with the voicemail, playing it over and over again like it was a cursed artifact, trying to decode what my response should be, what my life could look like if I stopped pretending emotions didn't exist. I imagined what it would be like to forgive him, to let go of the hurt I had clutched like a lifeline. But what if I opened that door? I could feel it slipping away, my carefully constructed defenses, and it terrified me in ways I couldn't articulate. That Saturday, I went for a drive, hoping maybe the road would guide me. I turned off my phone, pulled the windows down, and let the cold wind slap against my face, but nothing prepared me for what awaited me at the edge of a secluded forest road. An old woman appeared out of nowhere, standing beneath a gnarled tree with branches that looked like skeletal fingers reaching towards the sky. She wore a tattered shawl, and the rain trickled down her face like tears. I pressed the brake, stopping inches away from her. As I rolled down the window, she pointed a bony finger at me. "You carry heaviness, child. They will come for you." It was so absurd that I chuckled nervously, ready to dismiss her completely. But her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that froze the laughter in my throat. "You must embrace it, you know. Face your fears or remain a prisoner of your own heart," she said, her voice shaking. I felt a chill run down my spine. She spoke as if she knew about the voicemail, about everything I hadn't let myself feel. Before I could respond, she turned and walked away, fading into the drizzling twilight as if she were a figment of my imagination. I sat there in stunned silence, her words looping in my mind like a broken record. I drove home with a knot in my stomach, feeling distinctly haunted. The next day, determined to confront my emotions, I decided to visit my father. It felt surreal when I approached the sterile hospital room, but there was a nagging optimism gnawing at me. He looked frail, smaller than I remembered, and my heart softened despite all the armor I had wrapped around it. "I'm sorry," I stuttered as I walked in, unable to disguise my wavering voice. He looked up, startled, his eyes widening as if he was seeing me for the first time in years. "You don't have to be," he replied, but I could see the tears pooling in his eyes. I didn't want to move, afraid that the act of reaching out might shatter this fragile moment. But then I remembered the woman in the woods, her icy talon-like finger pointing at me, imploring me to embrace the fear rather than run from it. I stepped closer. "No, I need to say this. I've been angry for so long. I thought forgetting would make it easier, but it didn't. It only made it worse." Suddenly, all that pent-up emotion exploded like a shaken bottle of soda. I collapsed into sobs I didn't know were trapped inside me, drowning in the pain of all those lost years. To my surprise, my father didn't recoil. He reached out, frail fingers tapping my hand gently, and that simple act felt cathartic. We began exchanging stories, speaking of hurt, loss, regret, and, strangely, love. With each shared confession, I felt bricks fall from the wall I had built, one by one. There was laughter, amidst the tears. I learned that emotions could connect us, create bridges over the chasms time had carved in our relationship. Hours later, I left the hospital feeling lighter, cradling the newfound truth like a fragile artifact. The old woman hadn't just been right, she had been a messenger, though I didn't know how she knew. I returned to that forest road often, seeking her, needing guidance as I grappled with this evolution of my emotional landscape. Though I never ran into her again, I felt her presence within me, guiding me toward uncomfortable confrontations but also unlocking hidden joys. I learned to embrace all emotions, the heart-wrenching heartbreak, the soul-tingling joy, the awkward vulnerability. Each one, I discovered, told a story worth hearing. I slowly started to weave these emotions into my everyday life, and for the first time in years, I felt alive, at one with myself and others. I found comfort in family, friendship, and love. I even started writing again, pouring my truths onto paper, crafting tales born from the legitimacy of my experiences. I learned that embracing emotions wasn't about vulnerability or fear, it was a reclamation of the self. I still remember that old lady, her eerie words ingrained in my psyche, reminding me every day that we must face what haunts us. Life isn't meant to be lived armored, it's meant to be felt deeply, passionately. Who knew that in confronting the raw edges of my life, I'd find a rich tapestry of existence waiting on the other side of fear? Now, instead of avoiding my emotions, I wade through them, allowing their depths to color my world, no longer afraid of their weight, but empowered by their truth. I never thought that helping a child learn something new could lead down such a dark path. It started on an ordinary Tuesday evening. I was babysitting my neighbor's 10-year-old daughter, Lily, a bright and imaginative girl with an infectious curiosity. While her parents were out at a charity event, we decided to spend the evening doing something fun. I set up a little makeshift science lab in the kitchen, stocked with baking soda, vinegar, and a handful of colorful food dyes. We giggled through a few experiments, clouds of fizz and color erupting like tiny volcanoes. Lily was enthralled, her big brown eyes sparkling with excitement, and we ended up making a mess that would take her parents hours to clean up. As the hour got late, she pulled an old dusty book off the shelf titled Beginner's Guide to the Supernatural. I raised an eyebrow, half expecting it to be one of those cheesy kids' books about ghosts or magic. When she asked me to read it, I figured, why not? Crazy tales of spirits, haunted places, and bizarre rituals filled the pages. Somehow, the atmospheric descriptions made the stories linger in the air as if they were alive. One story, in particular, caught our attention, the tale of a game called The Hidden. It involved conjuring an entity through a series of simple questions and a daring invitation to join us here in the real world. Lily was mesmerized. I brushed it off at first, teasing her about believing in imaginary creatures, but then she powered through, her enthusiasm infectious. My initial hesitations melted away, and before I knew it, I found myself agreeing. We needed a quiet space, a bathroom, away from the prying eyes of the night. Armed with a flashlight and shaky hands, the two of us squeezed into the cramped space, the door locked behind us. I felt like a grown-up fool, indulging a child in fantasies, but her energy ignited a flickering spark of daring in me. I recalled a few spooky campfire stories from my own childhood and began to chant the rhyme that was strangely laid out in that tattered book. If you hear me, come to play, hide with us for a day. The air thickened, and a chill wind blew through the room, sending goosebumps racing down my arms. I laughed nervously, glancing at Lily, who was just as tense but brimming with excitement. We repeated the phrases, laughing at our nerves until the laughter faded. Then, a banging noise echoed from outside, rattling the window and startling us, shattering our fragile bubble of bravery. "Did you hear that?" Lily whispered, her voice quivering in the otherwise quiet darkness. I nodded, but held my breath instead of responding. As if the universe was mocking us, the bathroom lights flickered, illuminating faces of fear reflected in the tiny mirror. I could feel it too, something ancient, something restless was coming alive around us, clawing at the edges of the shadowed room. I held my breath as I lifted the flashlight, focusing its beam on the wall, half expecting a ghost to pop out and laugh at our expense. Just when I was about to make some silly joke to ease the tension, I heard the softest of whispers. It was barely audible, like a gentle brush of wind. "Help me." My heart slammed in my chest, a primal fear taking hold of my rational mind. The voice was distorted, sounding like an anguished child, a sound that cut through the veil of excitement that had cloaked me just moments ago. I glanced at Lily, her face pale and eyes wide as she clutched my sleeve, her grip tightening as if sensing my own dread. "Did you hear that?" she gasped, trembling. Committing to the bit felt like risking more than just our dignity now. I forced a shaky smile, trying to downplay the rising horror. "It's just the wind," I lied, but my voice trembled, bordering on panic. Without another word, we shared a look that determined our fate. We needed to escape this absurdity. In my effort to lead us out, I turned sharply, and the flashlight flickered. The beam illuminated the bathroom door, but the light flickered again, and my blood ran cold when I realized that Lily was no longer beside me. I spun around, frantic, sweeping the flashlight frantically. "Lily!" I called, freaking out inside, desperate. Then, the unmistakable creaking of the bathroom door echoed behind me. In the dim light, it swung open slowly, drawing a shadowy outline of what could have been Serenity, a small child-colored figure nestled in the folds of the inky dark. My heart raced as I barely recognized Lily standing in the doorway, but something was off. She wore a clown mask that had mysteriously appeared from nowhere. "Lily, take off the mask," I shouted, but there was a sparkle in her eye I had never seen before. "You said I should help it," she whispered, her voice low, as if she were colluding with something unseen. The flashlight flickered just as I reached the door, and I felt a force pulling me back. I stumbled, falling onto the bathroom tiles as an unsettling laughter filled the room, so haunting, it stretched beyond any rational explanation. The air swirled around me, heavy with an unseen presence that surrounded me like an invisible storm. "Help me," the voice echoed, now layered inside Lily's words, the resonance shifting as if it had intertwined with her very being. She stepped forward, and my heart raced as I realized her grip on reality was slipping. "Lily, come back," I shouted, scrambling against the floor. Just as suddenly as the darkness had enveloped us, the bathroom lights burst back on, illuminating the room in an icy fluorescent glare. As the shadows shrank and scattered, I lunged forward, forcing her mask to the ground, but the child I once knew was gone, replaced by a hollow gaze devoid of innocence. "She wants to play," she repeated, her voice strangely melodic. Panic twisted my stomach into knots as I grabbed her arm, desperately shaking her back to reality. "This isn't a game. Come back." But she just laughed, that childlike giggle, echoing off the walls, a sound that now felt more sinister than innocent. Sorrow pierced through me as utter hopelessness surged. Before I could process it all, the house shifted, the walls creaked and groaned, closing in around us. I fumbled at the door, but it slammed shut in my face. Was this some punishment for indulging a child's whimsy? "Help me," she whispered again, her eyes flickering with a blend of fear and admiration. I felt like I was losing her, slippage of time churning darker. Just as I feared that this could all spiral into something irreversible, a sense of clarity surged through me. I had to act fast, whatever this was, I couldn't let it take her. "If you want to play," I shouted, pulling everything inside me, "then let her go. This is a game, remember? Let her win." The laughter faded for a moment, replaced with an eerie silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. Lily blinked, momentarily shaken. "What?" I grabbed her shoulders, focusing every ounce of my will onto her. "You're stronger than this, Lily. Remember the experiments? Together we can control it." Her eyes flickered again, holding on to a glimmer of recognition. Just as the room shifted around us, shadows lurked menacingly, waiting for a response. The laughter resumed, but this time it felt fainter. "We can banish whatever this is," I yelled, picking up the mask and tossing it aside, the weight of darkness pressing down on us. "You have to fight. Fight back." For a heartbeat, the world around us stilled. Time twisted as if reality itself didn't know what to do next. Then, out of nowhere, a rush of cold air exploded through the space like a tsunami, and every door flung open. The laughter rose to a deafening crescendo, drowning me in vertigo. A shadow danced at the edge of my eyes, but in that heartbeat, I realized, laughter turned to screams. And in that blink, I found myself alone in the bathroom, a hollow void suddenly occupying the space where Lily once stood. My heart pounded violently in my chest, but I knew, somewhere deep down, that helping her was the only way to win this game. As the echoes of "help me" faded, forever lost in the chaotic whirlwind of uncertainty, I resolved to fight, to reclaim what had been taken. Because I refused to let this supernatural force steal her away without a struggle. Whatever had happened, whatever had taken over Lily, I was not finished. This was only the beginning, and by the end of this, I would make sure that child would learn something new, what it truly meant to fight back against the darkness. The day my ex came back, a roller coaster of emotions. The day my ex came back, a roller coaster of emotions. I never expected to see him again, let alone in the middle of the grocery store, while I was juggling a carton of eggs and a box of cereal. When I looked up, there he was, standing in the aisle, looking like some ghost from my past had come back to haunt me. My heart sank, then jumped, then fluttered in the span of 5 seconds. I hadn't seen Ben in over 3 years since we broke up in what had to be the most gut-wrenching and confusing breakup of my life. I froze, unsure whether to run or wave, but before I could decide, he saw me, too, and that familiar smirk crept across his face, the one that used to make my heart race and my mind turn to mush. He walked over, and suddenly, every memory, every emotion I thought I'd buried came flooding back, swirling around in my head like a tornado I couldn't escape. "Hey, it's been a while," he said casually, as if he hadn't been the one to vanish from my life without a trace. I stammered something resembling a greeting, trying to hide the storm brewing inside me. I asked him how he'd been, and before I knew it, we were chatting like old friends, catching up on lost years. He told me he was back in town temporarily, just for a few months for a work project, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was testing the waters, seeing if I was open to more. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him for coffee later in the week, part of me knowing this was a terrible idea, yet another part yearning to see if there was still something between us. That coffee date was surreal, a mix of nostalgia and awkward tension as we talked about our lives, our careers, our families, skirting around the elephant in the room, why he'd left so abruptly all those years ago. Eventually, I worked up the courage to ask him, to demand some sort of closure, but he brushed it off with a vague excuse about needing space and finding himself, as if those words could erase the heartache he'd left behind. But then, just when I thought he'd given me nothing, he confessed something that shook me to my core. He'd regretted leaving ever since, that not a day had passed when he didn't think about me. Suddenly, all the resentment I'd held onto, all the anger, started to crack, making way for something dangerous: hope. He asked if we could try again, if we could see where things might go now that we were older, wiser, supposedly more prepared for what love might throw at us. I told him I needed time to think, that I couldn't just forgive and forget like nothing had happened. But over the next few days, I found myself reliving all the good memories, the nights we'd stayed up talking about our dreams, the vacations we'd taken, the way he'd once looked at me like I was the only person in the world. Against all rational thought, I found myself wanting to say yes, wanting to believe that people could change, that we could be happy together again. We started seeing each other, cautiously at first, meeting for dinner, going on walks, just talking and getting to know each other again. But the closer we got, the more I felt those old wounds starting to reopen. I'd find myself second-guessing every word, every gesture, wondering if he was going to leave again, if he was really here to stay or just passing through my life one last time. One night, we were having dinner at his place when he brought up the future, casually mentioning things like moving in together, like getting a place if things work out. My stomach twisted with a mix of excitement and dread. I couldn't ignore the red flags waving in the back of my mind, but I was too far gone, too wrapped up in the dream of what could be to walk away now. Then, out of nowhere, I found a message on his phone one night, a message from someone named Jess, talking about how she missed him, how she couldn't wait to see him again. I confronted him, my heart pounding, my head spinning, and he tried to explain it away, saying she was just a friend, someone he hadn't completely cut ties with. But his stammering, his evasive gaze told me all I needed to know. He was still the same person who'd broken my heart all those years ago. The betrayal stung even worse this time, knowing I'd let him back in, knowing I'd opened myself up to the same pain all over again. I walked out that night, my heart shattered but also weirdly lighter, like I'd finally gotten the closure I needed. He tried calling, texting, apologizing, but I ignored every message, knowing that I'd finally reached the end of the roller coaster. For the first time in years, I felt free, like I could finally move on without wondering what if. And as much as it hurt, I knew I'd made the right choice. The past is meant to stay in the past, no matter how tempting it is to rewrite it. Aita forgoing no contact with my manipulative in-laws? I didn't think I would ever get to this point, but here I am, sitting on my couch, staring at my phone with a mix of dread and relief. The decision to go no contact with my in-laws wasn't made lightly, but after years of emotional manipulation and toxic interactions, I finally reached my breaking point. It all started innocently enough when I married my husband, Jake, 5 years ago. I was excited to become part of a new family, but I quickly realized that his parents had a different vision of what that meant. They were charming at first, always smiling and welcoming, but beneath that veneer lay a web of control and expectations that would soon entrap me. It began with subtle comments about how I should dress or how I should decorate my home. They would criticize my cooking or my approach to parenting, suggesting that I was not good enough for their son. I tried to brush it off, thinking they meant well, but it became increasingly clear that they thrived on criticism and guilt. Their behavior escalated when I became pregnant with our first child. Suddenly, my body was no longer my own. It was a topic of discussion at family gatherings. "Are you really going to eat that?" they would ask, scrutinizing my choices. "You should be more mindful of what you put into your body for the baby." I felt suffocated by their opinions, and every interaction felt like a test of my worthiness as a mother. The real tipping point came when our son was born. Jake and I were ecstatic, but my in-laws turned what should have been a joyous occasion into a power struggle. They insisted on being present in the delivery room, which made me uncomfortable. I thought it was a private moment meant for my husband and me, but they argued that they had a right to be there since they were family. Jake, caught between his loyalties, ultimately sided with them. The birth itself was overwhelming, and when my son finally arrived, my in-laws invaded the room like a storm, demanding to hold him and take pictures. I remember feeling a wave of resentment wash over me as they fawned over him while I lay exhausted in bed. Their behavior didn't stop there. They insisted on choosing our son's name, stating that it was a family tradition to honor a relative. They even created a family tree, tracing their lineage and inserting our son's name in the middle, as if it were their right. I felt completely powerless, and every time I voiced my concerns to Jake, he brushed them aside, insisting that they were just excited grandparents. I began to feel like a stranger in my own home, and the emotional manipulation reached a boiling point during my son's first birthday party. I had envisioned a small gathering with close friends and family, but my in-laws took over the planning, inviting their friends and turning it into a lavish affair that felt more like a wedding than a birthday party. When I expressed my desire for a more intimate celebration, they accused me of being ungrateful. I felt trapped, and when the day finally arrived, I could barely enjoy it. I stood on the sidelines as they played host, taking charge of every aspect of the event while I struggled to keep my composure. After that day, I realized I couldn't continue living like this. I felt suffocated by their expectations and constantly judged by their standards. Jake didn't see the damage being done to our relationship, and every time I tried to explain my feelings, he dismissed my concerns, telling me I was overreacting. I knew I had to make a choice, and that's when I decided to go no contact with my in-laws. It wasn't an easy decision. I felt guilty for cutting them off, but I knew it was necessary for my mental health. I wrote a letter to them, explaining my feelings and the reasons for my decision. I expressed my love for Jake and our son but made it clear that their behavior was unacceptable. I sent the letter and braced myself for the fallout. When I told Jake what I had done, he was furious. He accused me of tearing our family apart and being selfish. "They're my parents. You can't just erase them from our lives, he yelled, and I felt the weight of his disappointment crashing down on me. I tried to explain my side, but he was too angry to listen. Days turned into weeks, and the silence was deafening. I felt a mix of relief and guilt, but I was finally able to breathe again. I focused on rebuilding my relationship with Jake, but the tension lingered. Eventually, Jake's parents began reaching out through texts and emails, trying to manipulate the situation further. They claimed to be devastated and heartbroken, pleading for a chance to talk. I ignored their messages, knowing that engaging with them would only drag me back into the toxicity I had fought so hard to escape. It was then that I realized how deeply ingrained their influence was in our lives. Jake began to withdraw, spending more time at his parents' house and less with me and our son. It felt like a betrayal, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was choosing them over us. One evening, after another heated argument about my in-laws, Jake came home late. He reeked of alcohol and sadness, and I could see the weight of his guilt etched on his face. "I just don't understand how you could do this," he said, tears welling in his eyes. "They're my family." I felt my heart break for him, but I also felt an overwhelming sense of anger for how he had failed to protect me. "You're choosing them over our family," I replied, my voice trembling. "You don't see how toxic they are." In that moment, I realized we were at a crossroads. I loved him, but I couldn't continue living in a situation where my mental health was compromised. I made the tough decision to give him an ultimatum. "You need to choose, Jake. It's either me and our son or them." His face twisted in anguish as he realized the gravity of the situation. He took a step back, visibly shaken by my words. "I can't do that," he whispered, his voice cracking. "They're my parents." I felt like my heart was shattering, knowing that he was unable to see the toxicity that had infiltrated our lives. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in our home grew unbearable. I focused on my son, pouring my love into him while Jake remained distant, torn between his parents and his family. Eventually, the breaking point came during a family gathering at my sister's house. Jake's parents showed up uninvited, determined to make their presence known. I felt my heart race as I watched them waltz into the party, their smiles wide and fake. They immediately began taking charge, asking my sister questions about the decorations and planning the menu without so much as a hello to me. I felt my blood boil as they ignored my existence, and when they pulled my son away to show him off to their friends, I snapped. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "Can you please give me back my son?" The room fell silent, and all eyes turned to me. Jake's parents looked shocked, their smiles fading as they processed my words. "He's not your prop to show off," I continued, my voice rising. "He's my son." The tension was palpable as my sister tried to defuse the situation, but I felt a rush of liberation. I was no longer the silent victim, I was reclaiming my voice. Jake stepped in, his expression a mix of anger and embarrassment. "What are you doing?" he hissed. "This isn't the time or place." "No, Jake. This is exactly the time," I replied, my heart racing. "I'm done playing nice. Your parents are manipulative, and I refuse to let them dictate our lives any longer." The argument escalated, and it felt like a dam had finally broken. I didn't hold back, laying bare all the resentment I had been holding inside. I spoke about how their behavior had affected me and how their constant manipulation had put a strain on our marriage. I could see the shock on everyone's faces, including Jake's. He looked torn, caught between defending his parents and protecting me. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake's parents retreated, their smiles replaced by scowls. They left the party in a huff, and I felt a strange sense of victory. I had finally stood up for myself, but it came at a price. The aftermath was brutal. Jake was furious and hurt, and our relationship became strained. I felt like I had taken a bold step for my mental health, but it had shattered the fragile bond we had built over the years. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You could have just let it go." "I couldn't let it go anymore, Jake. I needed you to see how toxic they are," I replied, my heart aching. But I knew he was still blinded by his loyalty to them, and the gulf between us grew wider. I started to question my decision to go no contact. Was I wrong for wanting to protect myself? Had I destroyed my family in the process? As days turned into weeks, I found solace in the Support of my friends and sister, who reassured me that I had made the right choice. They reminded me of the emotional toll my in-laws had taken on my mental health. I began to rebuild my life, focusing on my son and my own well-being, but the pain of losing Jake lingered like a shadow. Eventually, I reached out to a therapist who helped me process my feelings of guilt and anger. I began to understand that going no contact wasn't a punishment, it was a necessary step. The time I tried a new form of exercise and loved it is not just a cute anecdote, it's a warning wrapped in a tale almost too bizarre to believe. This happened last autumn, a dreary season that usually sends me into a spiral of Netflix binges and frozen pizza dinners, but I was determined to shake things up. I had read about a new fitness class that was all the rage, a blend of dance and martial arts, a thing called urban grit. They advertised it as a way to unleash your inner warrior while getting a workout that will make you feel like a superhero. The images on their website featured ethereal lighting and grinning participants who seemed to float through the air in some sort of euphoric dance, but curiosity got the better of me. So, one fateful evening, I decided to give it a try. I showed up at this warehouse on the outskirts of town, a place that looked more like a set for a horror movie than a fitness studio. The walls were coated in graffiti, and eerie lighting seeped through from the small, grimy windows. I walked in, and my heart sank. The place was packed. Young people, older folks, all of them decked out in colorful workout gear, stretching in odd ways like some sort of bizarre ritual. I felt like an imposter. Misfit that I am, I tried to find my place in this motley crew, awkwardly trying to follow their lead through a bizarre series of movements that felt half like dancing and half like they were preparing to battle some unseen foe. The instructor, an imposing figure with a wild mane of hair and a fiery spirit, entered and melded right into this strange syntactic flexibility of bodies and energy. "Welcome, warriors," he boomed, and I instantly felt a prickle of fear. Who was I kidding? I just wanted to shed a few pounds, maybe tone up a little, not join some cult of dancers. But every graceful swing and kick seemed to build some sort of ephemeral connection among the group. It was exhilarating. I was swept up in the energy, the sweat glistening on my brow, my feet moving as if guided by some external force. As I threw myself into the rhythm, I let go of my self-consciousness, and for the first time in ages, I actually had fun. The more enthusiasm I exerted, the more welcoming the group became. I was starting to feel exhilarated. Midway through the class, it happened. Some people began to hoot and holler like they were in an arena rather than a studio. I dropped to the floor, panting, but a strange compulsion pulled me toward them. I didn't know how it happened, but suddenly, I was not just part of the class, I was enveloped in it. I felt every fiber of my being gravitate toward the center, my spirit rising with each sudden echo of a foot on the wood floor. We all seemed to move in unison, but then I realized it wasn't just order, there was something otherworldly about it. It was a call, a strange resonance vibrating through the very architecture of the place. The beams above flickered oddly as if reacting to our movements, and a burst of light shot across the space, temporarily blinding me. My heart raced, and yet for some reason I felt alive, as if the air was charged with something primal. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like we weren't just burning calories, we were tapping into something ancestral. As the final minutes of the class drew near, the atmosphere crackled with unexplainable energy. We finished a final series of movements and transitioned into a circle, each of us panting yet exhilarated. The instructor's voice boomed above the thrumming energy, "Feel the bond. Feel the power." And just like that, I realized, I was in love with this new form of exercise. I didn't want to leave. The communal high I felt bound me to these strangers. As we finished, our diverse group broke into a ritualistic echo of whoops and yells, a chorus of ecstatic release that seemed to dance through the air. I felt compelled to return. The following week, I hesitantly showed up for another class and was met with applause from my newfound friends, the energy palpable and inviting. This became my routine. I was sucked in completely. Each session lent me more confidence, but I started noticing odd changes. My senses heightened, colors seemed sharper, smells were vivid, and I found myself inexplicably drawn to the shadows lurking in the corners of the warehouse. The energy became intoxicating, we moved as one entity. One evening, just as we finished yet another exhilarating session, I caught a glimpse of something peculiar in the corner of the room, something that wasn't there before. A long, shadowy figure, contorting and twisting, moving with a grace beyond comprehension. I blinked, and it vanished. Just a trick of the light, I thought, but paranoia trickled into my subconscious. I couldn't shake it. I voiced my concerns to the instructor, caught in a whirlwind of fellow warriors laughing and shouting as they leapt about the room. But even he seemed shaken, just for a moment, and quickly deflected my concerns. "You're becoming more in tune with the energy," he reassured, but my gut told me differently. I began to have unsettling dreams. I could hear whispers in my sleep of faceless figures urging me to join them. The synchronicity within the class seemed to deepen, and a flicker of dread replaced my excitement. Every week, shadows were more pronounced, now peppered with long glances and unexpected appearances that would fade into nothingness. The energy felt darker. One night, mid-class, I could hear chanting, a low, guttural sound reverberating through the walls. I could see the instructor's eyes flicker. For a brief moment, they weren't just wild and electric, they were fearful. The class continued, but my unease grew. The movements twisted, each leap and kick feeling heavy, aligning in a way that I felt compelled to unify with whatever lurked. As autumn deepened, the shadows seemed to loom, clinging possessively to the walls, and the rituals turned sinister. The group seemed less like a gym class and more like participants in whatever ceremony had taken over the space. I felt trapped, almost fused with the energy. I needed out. On the last fateful night I returned, I knew deep down that I was not in a class anymore but part of something sleepily dreadful. I can still remember the chants echoing through the air, the flickering lights that swirled around the room, and before I knew it, something erupted from within the shadows, a room filled with hollow figures, each one breaking apart into webs of darkness, pulling the light from everyone like a black hole in the night. I tried to scream, but the sounds became mere whispers lost in the void. I ran, and the shadows laughed. Now they were faces, twisted with wicked delight. I never looked back. I've since tried to forget, but the pull lingers. It's as if they call to me, urging me to return to where the energy flows not like a vibrant dance but like a dark tide. So, if you're feeling adventurous and are looking for that new exercise regime, just remember how I found mine, and be wary of the shadows that may await you in the dance of urban grit. The gym might not be just a gym, it may very well be a portal to something else, something you can't unjoin once the music fades. It was a bleak, rain-soaked evening when I found myself in a small, dimly lit coffee shop on the outskirts of town, a perfect setting for introspection or perhaps a good scare. I'd just finished my shift at the local diner, the clatter of plates and the hum of customers' chatter still echoing in my mind. I ordered a bitter cup of coffee, the kind that seemed to drain the very light from the room, and settled into a corner booth with my laptop, mostly to distract myself from the unsettling thoughts swirling in my mind. The usual crowd was absent, perhaps sheltering from the storm that battered the windows, but in the shadowy corners of the coffee shop, I noticed an older gentleman, his hair wild, beard unkempt, and eyes glimmering with a strange intensity that pulled me in like a lighthouse beacon in the fog. As the minutes turned into an hour, the rain fell harder, creating a rhythmic drumming against the glass that seemed to amplify the silence around us. I couldn't help but steal glances at him. He sat alone, occasionally stirring a murky cup of tea, and every so often, he'd mumble something that I couldn't quite catch. My curiosity piqued as I tried to focus on my work, but the allure of his solitude proved stronger. I found myself leaving my laptop open, half-finished, and venturing closer. It was an impulsive move, one that felt both reckless and intoxicating. "You look like you've got a good story to tell," I said, half-jokingly. The man looked up, fixed his gazes on me with those piercing eyes, and for a moment, the world around us disappeared. "You could say that," he replied, his voice raspy and low, as if he'd been holding on to secrets for longer than I could imagine. I hesitated, the conversation hanging in the air, and finally asked, "What's your story?" He hesitated only a moment before launching into a tale that felt like it had been carefully woven through the threads of time itself. Quickly, I lost track of the space and sound around us, utterly captivated. He began with his childhood, tales of laughter echoing through a bustling household, of loving parents who listened intently to every story he spun, no matter how trivial. I nodded, a part of me envious of the warmth in those memories, but the ambience shifted as the gentleman plunged deeper into his past, a darkness overshadowing his nostalgia. He spoke of how, as he grew up, he felt his voice gradually fading. School became a battlefield, where every attempt to connect would be met with mockery and indifference. There was something haunting in his recounting of moments when he would speak up, only to have his words drowned out by noise. I leaned forward, drawn into his melancholy. Each word resonated with me, as he described the slow disintegration of his ability to share, to express. He revealed that he had once been an aspiring writer, but the rejection letters piled up over time, and with each one, he felt smaller, lesser, words turned into a prison. My heart went out to him, and I found myself silently wishing I could take those moments back, give him the encouragement he so desperately craved. But there was one night, he continued, a flicker of light returning to his weary eyes. I was alone, on a bridge, the city sprawling beneath me, a million lives buzzing unaware of my existence. I was ready to let go, to silence everything forever. But then, I heard something. My stomach twisted in apprehension, urging me to listen closer. A voice, he whispered, a soft voice carried by the wind. It wasn't just any voice, it was a woman's voice, singing. I turned, hoping to see her, but there was nothing. Just a cold breeze. Yet, that voice was full of such warmth, such depth. It wrapped around me like a blanket, and I realized, she was listening. She heard me in my silence. My breath caught as he spoke. Something deep within stirred, and I could feel tears prickling at the corners of my eyes, the intensity of his revelation washing over me. From that moment, he said, I grasped the power of listening. It's not just a passive act, it's an active investment in someone's story. The very act of truly listening can save a life. Each pause, each tremor in his voice, resonated with truth, yet there was something inexplicable about the way he looked past me, as if he could see all the people who had ever wandered through his life, each one a thread in the elaborate tapestry he was trying to weave. The coffee shop remained unchanged around us, time froze, and the storm outside grew more tumultuous, almost in harmony with the emotions we shared in that cloud of intimacy. I finally mustered the courage to ask, did you ever find her? The one who was singing. A shadow crossed his face, darkening his features. I never did. But her song stayed with me. It reminds me, everyone has a story, a heartbeat that deserves to be acknowledged. If we just listen. I could hardly breathe, the weight of his words settled within me, enveloping me in both sorrow and hope. And every so often, I find that if I listen hard enough, I can still hear her song. It was surreal. Just an old man sharing his burdens over bitter coffee, yet I felt like I was grasping the intangible threads of connection, the fabric of humanity itself. As he continued to unravel his life, I realized that my own fears and insecurities paled in comparison to the depths of his struggles. A reflection of our shared humanity shone brightly in that tiny, rain-soaked coffee shop. Hours passed like minutes, and I was transported away from my own worries, my job, my loneliness, my day-to-day drudgeries. Here was a man who had battled the silence, who had come to understand the beautiful act of listening and its power to unlock the darkest corners of despair. As the night wore on and the storm finally began to ebb, he paused and glanced at his watch. I should go, he murmured, as if he had just broken free from a spell. I felt the pull of reality returning like the tide rolling in, overwhelming with the rush of adrenaline and dread. Will I see you again? The moment hung heavy in the air, charged with the weight of unspoken words. Perhaps, he said softly, but remember this, my friend, never underestimate the power of listening. It can change lives. He rose and walked toward the exit, as if gravity had finally released him. I stared after him as he faded into the night, the bell above the door jingling softly. I sat in the coffee shop long after he left, a bittersweet ache filling my heart, the lonely quietness of the room echoing his parting words. It was true, I had spent my life so busy talking, sharing my own stories, drowning out the voices crying for attention. I was simply looking for someone to listen to me, while failing to see that the world was made richer by the stories of others. I finally closed my laptop, the words left untyped, an unspoken promise etched into my heart. The storm had let up. I stepped outside into the damp, crisp air, filled with renewed purpose. I began to walk, determined to carry forth the lesson I learned that night, to listen, to hear the songs of those around me. And as I strolled through the silent streets, the world pulsated with stories yet to be discovered. I would honor that gentleman's legacy, one heartbeat at a time. Little did I know, he had already begun to etch a significant mark on my life and perhaps the lives of others too, all by simply sharing his heartfelt moment and reminding me of the transformative power of listening. How I survived an unexpected layoff, my resilience. The day I found out I was laid off started like any other ordinary Thursday, with me hustling to the office, balancing a coffee in one hand and my laptop bag in the other, completely unaware that my life was about to be turned upside down. I was in that comfortable routine where you start to feel like things are stable, predictable, maybe even a little too safe, and I guess that's when life decides to throw you a curveball. I got to my desk, powered up my computer, and was about to dive into my emails when I got the message, a cold, impersonal email from HR that simply said there would be a mandatory meeting at 10 a.m., with no details, no explanation. My stomach dropped. I knew something wasn't right. By the time I walked into the meeting room, there was a tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife, and I saw the familiar faces of my colleagues looking as anxious and pale as I felt. Our manager came in, followed by the head of HR, who quickly glanced around before delivering the bombshell news. Due to company restructuring, they said, we have to make some difficult decisions today. There was that word, restructuring. The polite way of saying that many of us wouldn't have jobs by the end of the day. And that's exactly what happened. My position was one of the ones eliminated, effective immediately. I sat there in shock, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. My mind spun as they handed me a thin envelope with severance details, a polite but insincere thank you for your contributions, and instructions to gather my things and leave by noon. It felt like an out-of-body experience, packing up my desk while my coworkers either stared in sympathy or avoided eye contact entirely. I drove home in a daze, feeling an unsettling cocktail of fear, anger, and sadness, with no idea what to do next. The first few days were brutal. I was terrified and spent most of my time either updating my resume or scrolling through endless job listings that all started to blur together, feeling like I'd never be able to get back on my feet. Every rejection email that came and chipped away at me, each one a painful reminder that I wasn't needed, wasn't wanted, that the world was just fine without me in it. But somehow, somewhere deep down, I felt this tiny spark of stubborn resilience telling me I couldn't just give up. I realized I needed to shift my perspective, so instead of letting myself sink into the fear, I forced myself to take action, any action, just to keep moving. I started to set small goals for myself, and with every little win, my confidence inched back. I applied for jobs every morning, took online courses in the afternoons to learn new skills, and worked out in the evenings to keep my mind clear. I even started a blog, just as a way to process everything, writing about the experience and about resilience, hoping that maybe, somehow, sharing my story would make this experience a little less isolating. And that's when something unexpected happened. People started reaching out to me. Strangers who'd stumbled upon my blog, friends I hadn't heard from in years, even former colleagues who told me my words had resonated with them and that they were facing similar struggles. It was surreal, this sense of connection forming in the middle of my darkest time, and it made me realize that maybe I wasn't as alone as I'd thought. Then one day, as I was sifting through the usual job rejections, an email popped up in my inbox from someone I'd never met before. It was a small startup looking for someone with exactly my skill set, and they'd found me through my blog posts. We set up an interview, and within a week, I had a job offer on the table, one that paid less than my previous role but felt like a golden ticket because it came with the sense of purpose and excitement I hadn't felt in years. And so, here I am now, looking back on the last few months with a mix of disbelief and gratitude. Surviving that layoff wasn't just about finding a new job, it was about discovering strength I didn't know I had, about learning to find opportunity in the chaos, and about understanding that sometimes, the lowest points in life lead you to the most unexpected places. That layoff forced me to rebuild from scratch, but it also gave me a new sense of direction, a fresh start I never would have taken on my own. I still have hard days, days when the fear creeps back in or when I feel the sting of rejection again, but I know now that I have it in me to push through, to adapt, and to keep going no matter what. And as strange as it sounds, I'm grateful for that layoff, for the shakeup that pushed me out of my comfort zone and forced me to find a path that's more fulfilling than I ever thought possible. I wasn't expecting to find anything significant that day. It all started out like a normal Saturday, the kind where you just want to lounge around, maybe watch some movies or play video games. But when I woke up late in the afternoon, I realized I had a laundry basket full of dirty clothes that needed to be taken care of. So, begrudgingly, I hopped in my car and headed to the laundromat down the street. It was the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 90s, with flickering fluorescent lights and oversized machines that wheezed and rattled as they worked. As I loaded my clothes into the washer, I noticed a woman sitting in the corner, hunched over a stack of papers, her brow furrowed in concentration. I'd seen her around, she came in often, always with that same intense look. I judged her silently, thinking, what could be so difficult about doing laundry? But she caught me staring and offered a thin smile, a gesture I quickly returned, albeit awkwardly. When my machine was full, I sat down at the row of seats opposite her, waiting for the cycle to finish. As I scrolled through my phone, I couldn't help but take glances at her. A few minutes later, she suddenly slammed her papers onto the table with a frustrated sigh, and I was jolted from my distraction. I could see now that the papers were filled with sketches and notes, some sort of project that was clearly stressing her out. I felt a twinge of sympathy, so I dared to ask, "Is everything okay?" She looked up at me, surprised, her blue eyes cutting through the dim light of the laundromat. "It's just this presentation for work. I'm an architect, trying to design a community center, but every idea I sketch isn't translating the way I want." I nodded, not really knowing what to say. I had no artistic skills whatsoever and couldn't fathom the level of work that went into something like that. "Why not just take a break?" I suggested half-heartedly, not thinking it would mean much. But her response took me off guard. "If I take a break, it feels like I'm giving up. You know how hard it is to be taken seriously in my field? There's no room for weakness." I started to respond, but instead, I found myself staring at her sketches, the lines flowing but imprecise, the vision blurring before me, much like her expression. At that moment, something clicked in my mind. I had been feeling lost in my own life, stuck in a job I hated, going through the motions without a clear direction. This woman's struggle was like a mirror that reflected my own. I decided to be more open. "I get that pressure. I'm just a graphic designer, but I feel like everything I create never lives up to my expectations either." This moved her, and she leaned forward a little, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. "Really? That's kind of surprising. I mean, artistry is subjective. Isn't it easier to just create because it makes you happy?" I chuckled, almost a scoff. "You'd think, but it's hard when you're constantly comparing yourself to others. Social media is the worst for that, seeing other designers' perfect work all the time makes you feel inadequate." She smirked. "Welcome to the world of architecture. It's like everyone thinks they're an expert when they see a finished building. They forget that it came from flaws, late nights, and complete breakdowns." We both chuckled at that, as a sense of understanding passed between us. Her humor was infectious, and for the first time that day, I felt like I might not be alone in my feelings of inadequacy. As our conversation continued, she shared how she found herself overthinking everything, how she had taken years to learn to trust her instincts. "It's hard, but I've learned that every setback is a chance to reassess," she said. "Sometimes, the best ideas come from mistakes." I absorbed her words, as they resonated deep within me. I realized then how much I had been holding myself back, how fear of failure had paralyzed my own creativity. Just as I was starting to feel inspired, the washing machine beeped, interrupting our moment. I rushed to transfer my clothes to the dryer while she prepared to leave. Just before she walked out, she paused, looking back at me. "Remember, it's not about perfection. It's about progress. Don't let comparison steal your joy." And with that, she disappeared through the laundromat's door. I stood there, stunned as I felt her words sink deep into my bones. I finished my laundry, feeling lighter somehow, almost renewed. On my drive home, I suddenly had a rush of ideas for my own work, things I had buried under self-doubt. I pulled out my sketchbook and started drafting designs on the side of the road, the urge to create overtaking me. I spent the next few days pouring myself into projects, no longer tethered by the need for validation. It felt liberating. Then, about a week later, I returned to the laundromat, hoping to see her again. I wanted to thank her, share my progress, everything had changed because of that moment we shared. Yet, when I arrived, the seats were empty, and she was nowhere to be found. I asked the older attendant if she had seen the woman, and with a puzzled frown, he shook his head. "Not around here, kid. I don't remember anyone like that." Confused and disappointed, I left, feeling like I had been chasing a ghost. Weeks passed, and I continued to refine my work, slowly gaining confidence. I even took part in a local art show, where I displayed the work that had been inspired by that chance encounter. The community center project I created took home the prize for innovation, and I felt pride swell inside me. I always wondered about that woman, wondered if she was real or a figment of my imagination. Then one evening, out of the blue, while I was scrolling through social media, I found an article featuring an upcoming community center project. The picture was of her drawings, the very same sketches I had seen that day at the laundromat. The headline read, "Local architect overcomes self-doubt to inspire community designs." I felt my heart race. The article featured her story, detailing her struggles, her journey of failure, but ultimately triumph. I was ecstatic for her success but utterly confused about the nature of our encounter. I read the piece several times, trying to piece everything together, feeling like I was in some parallel universe. After finishing, I thought about how much I needed that conversation, how it had propelled both of us in different ways. It reminded me that life lessons often come when you least expect them, from people you might never see again. I don't know if I'll ever cross paths with her again, but I'm thankful for the moment in that dimly lit laundromat. It was there, surrounded by the mundane, that I encountered the extraordinary truth that failure doesn't define us, it's the courage to keep going that ultimately shapes our path. So, if you ever find yourself feeling lost, remember, inspiration can be found in the most unexpected places. Even if it's a laundromat on a nondescript Saturday afternoon. How I accidentally became the office hero. It all started on a typical Wednesday morning. The office was bustling with its usual monotony, emails to send, meetings to attend, reports to prepare. I was just another cog in the wheel, trying to get through the workday without attracting too much attention. I was never the type to stand out at work. I was the quiet one, the one who stayed under the radar and did my job without causing any waves. It's not that I didn't want to be noticed, but I didn't exactly crave the spotlight either. I was content to stay in my lane, keep to myself, and let the more outgoing personalities take the lead. But everything changed when the coffee machine broke. It sounds trivial, I know, but it was the catalyst for something that would turn my entire life upside down. The coffee machine was the lifeblood of the office. We had a fancy espresso machine that made the best coffee in town, and everyone depended on it. People would come into work, grab their morning cup, and immediately feel ready to take on the world, or at least take on their inbox. But that morning, as I shuffled into the break room, I saw it, the coffee machine was down. The display screen blinked red with an error message I didn't understand. I could hear people grumbling in the background, the murmur of discontent growing louder as the realization hit everyone. There would be no coffee today. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. I wasn't the most tech-savvy person in the office, and I certainly wasn't the one people turned to for problem-solving. But I couldn't ignore the growing chorus of complaints around me. So, without really thinking, I did what any reasonable person would do, I tried to fix the coffee machine. I didn't know the first thing about how it worked, but I knew I couldn't just stand there and watch people spiral into a caffeine-deprived panic. I started pressing buttons, fiddling with the machine's components, hoping that somehow, I'd accidentally trigger the right response. To my surprise, after a few minutes of trial and error, the machine hummed to life. It sputtered for a moment, then began to brew coffee as if nothing had ever gone wrong. I stood there, stunned. I had actually fixed it. I turned around, and the entire break room had fallen silent. Everyone was staring at me, their mouths agape, like I'd just performed a miracle. "You fixed it?" someone asked, disbelief in their voice. I nodded, suddenly feeling very self-conscious. People began to applaud, clapping slowly at first, then growing louder as they realized what had just happened. "Thank God," someone muttered. "We were going to have to go to Starbucks." The applause continued as people grabbed their cups of coffee, murmuring praise as they passed by me. At that moment, I felt a strange sense of pride, but it was short-lived. I didn't want to be the center of attention. I was just trying to help out. But something about the way people reacted stuck with me. Word of my heroic act spread like wildfire throughout the office. Suddenly, people started coming to me with their tech issues, asking if I could help them troubleshoot their computer problems, fix their printers, or even recommend software. I wasn't qualified for any of this. I was just the guy who fixed the coffee machine, but to everyone else, I was some kind of office wizard. It was flattering, but also a little overwhelming. I started receiving emails from people I barely knew, asking for my help. It felt like I couldn't escape it. It wasn't long before my boss, who had been in the back of the room during the coffee machine incident, took notice. "You're really good at solving problems, huh?" she said one afternoon as she caught me on my way to lunch. "Maybe we should get you more involved in some of the office's tech issues." I was stunned. Me? Involved in office tech? I barely knew how to work the projector in the conference room. But before I could decline, she handed me a folder and told me to take a look at some upcoming projects. Apparently, my coffee machine incident had branded me as the office's go-to tech guy. The next few weeks were a blur. I started fixing printers, organizing software installations, and answering questions about email configurations, all tasks I was woefully unqualified to handle. But somehow, I made it work. Every time I fixed something, I could feel the weight of the office's expectations pressing down on me. It wasn't just about the coffee machine anymore. I had become the person people turned to when something went wrong. My colleagues, who once barely acknowledged my presence, were now coming to me for advice, asking for my opinion, and even inviting me to lunch. I was getting invited to team meetings I had no business being in, and somehow, I was becoming part of the office's inner circle. It felt good, at first. I enjoyed the recognition, the newfound friendships, and the sense of purpose that came with being the hero. But over time, it started to wear on me. I wasn't a tech expert. I didn't want to be the person people relied on for everything. I just wanted to do my job and go home. The pressure built, and I started to feel suffocated. I couldn't go a day without someone asking me for help with something. It was like I had accidentally signed up for a role I wasn't prepared for. One morning, after fixing yet another printer issue for the 10th time that week, I found myself staring at the break room door, wondering if I could just take the coffee machine and run away with it. I wanted to escape. I wanted to go back to being the quiet, unnoticed person I had been before. But as I looked around the office, I realized something: I had made a difference. People were relying on me, yes, but they were also appreciating me in a way I hadn't experienced before. They trusted me. And maybe, just maybe, that was something worth holding on to. I never set out to be the office hero. It just kind of happened. I didn't have a plan, didn't expect it, and certainly didn't ask for it. But in the end, I learned something important. Sometimes the greatest things in life come from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, being the hero doesn't mean having all the answers, it just means being willing to step up when it matters most. So, while I may not be the office wizard I'm made out to be, I've learned to embrace my accidental role. After all, no one's ever too old to be surprised by how much they can achieve. The Gift That Ruined Christmas, a Family Feud. The Gift That Ruined Christmas, a Family Feud. The Christmas I'll never forget started with the best of intentions, as these things often do, and spiraled into something I couldn't have imagined even in my worst holiday nightmares. It had always been a sacred tradition in our family to gather at my grandparents' house every year, no matter the weather, no matter how far we had to travel. The air would be filled with the scent of cinnamon and pine, the halls decorated with garlands and fairy lights, and the living room practically bursting with presents under the enormous tree. My grandmother, ever the meticulous hostess, ensured everything ran smoothly, from the perfectly cooked Christmas ham to the carefully orchestrated gift exchange. But that year, a single present managed to unravel decades of tradition and harmony, sparking a feud that tore through our family like a raging wildfire. It began innocently enough. We were all gathered around the tree, sipping on eggnog and laughing at Uncle Joe's terrible dad jokes, when my cousin Emily handed out the last gift. It was a small, tastefully wrapped box, and it had my Uncle Greg's name on it. Emily, ever the prankster, flashed a mischievous grin as she passed it to him. Everyone leaned in, intrigued, expecting another one of her infamous joke gifts. Uncle Greg raised an eyebrow, his curiosity piqued. He carefully peeled away the wrapping paper, revealing a sleek black box. His eyes widened when he saw the name on the lid, Heritage DNA. "You didn't," he said, half amused, half nervous. Emily giggled. "I did. Come on, you've been talking about wanting to trace our roots for ages. Now you can do it." The room buzzed with laughter and chatter, everyone speculating about what Uncle Greg's ancestry results might reveal. But beneath the surface, something shifted. My dad's face grew pale, and I noticed my grandmother's smile tighten, the joy draining from her eyes. At the time, I didn't think much of it, chalking it up to the general chaos of Christmas morning. But the tension that settled over the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Uncle Greg chuckled awkwardly, putting the box aside. "Thanks, Emily. I'll, definitely check it out later," he said, but the way his voice wavered made my stomach knot. For a moment, the festivities resumed, though with an odd undercurrent of unease. But when my grandmother suddenly excused herself and disappeared into the kitchen, my dad followed her, his brow furrowed with concern. The rest of us exchanged uneasy glances, unsure if we should intervene or pretend nothing was wrong. Being the nosy person I am, I decided to investigate. I quietly made my way to the kitchen, careful not to draw attention to myself, and listened in on their hushed conversation. "How could she do this?" my grandmother was saying, her voice cracking. "After everything we've worked to keep hidden." "Mom, calm down," my dad whispered, though he sounded anything but calm. "We don't even know if he'll go through with it. It might mean nothing. Or it could mean everything," my grandmother snapped. "Our whole family. It could all come crashing down." My heart raced, and I stepped back, trying to process what I'd just overheard. Hidden secrets. A family history they were desperate to keep buried? It was like something out of a soap opera, but this was real, and it was happening right in front of me. When I returned to the living room, the atmosphere had grown even frostier. Uncle Greg, oblivious to the drama unfolding in the kitchen, was laughing with my aunts and uncles, but it felt forced, like everyone was trying too hard to maintain the facade of Christmas cheer. Later that evening, after dinner, the tension boiled over. My dad pulled Uncle Greg aside, and I saw them talking in the corner, their voices growing louder with each passing minute. "Just don't do it," my dad was saying, his voice tinged with desperation. "You don't know what you're getting into." Uncle Greg's face darkened. "What's your problem?" he snapped. "It's a harmless test. I just want to know where we come from. Why are you acting so weird?" My dad's jaw clenched, and he glanced nervously around the room, where the rest of the family was pretending not to listen. "It's not harmless," he hissed. "There are things better left buried." The room fell silent, all eyes on the two of them. Emily, looking horrified, tried to interject. "Guys, I didn't mean to start anything. It was just a gift, for fun." But my dad wasn't listening. "You have no idea what kind of damage this could do," he said, his voice breaking. Uncle Greg glared at him, his fists clenched. "What are you so afraid of?" he demanded. "What are you hiding?" And then, to everyone's shock, my grandmother stormed into the room, her face pale and eyes blazing. "Enough," she shouted, her voice trembling with anger and something that looked like fear. "If you must know the truth, then fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." The room fell into stunned silence. Even the youngest kids, who had been playing with their new toys, stopped and stared. My grandmother took a deep breath, and I could see the weight of whatever secret she was about to reveal pressing down on her. "Years ago," she began, her voice wavering, "before any of you were born, there was a situation. A mistake, one that could have ruined us. We thought we'd put it behind us, but this DNA test, it could bring everything back." My heart pounded as she went on, detailing a sordid story of an affair, a hidden pregnancy, and a family cover-up that sounded like something out of a crime novel. Apparently, one of our uncles, an uncle we'd grown up with, loved, and called family, might not be related to us by blood. The details were hazy, and she clearly left out parts she couldn't bear to say out loud, but the damage was done. The room erupted into chaos. Accusations were hurled, tears were shed, and the warm glow of Christmas had been extinguished, replaced by a bitter, icy storm of betrayal. Emily was sobbing, blaming herself for the fallout, while Uncle Greg sat in stunned silence, clutching the DNA kit like it was a grenade that had just gone off in his hands. My dad and my grandmother were at odds, their alliance shattered as old wounds were ripped open. I watched as our family, the one that had always seemed so strong and united, crumbled before my eyes. It was a scene I never thought I'd witness, the kind of drama you read about in books or watch in movies but never expect to happen to you. Christmas was officially ruined, not by a lack of gifts or a burnt dinner, but by the revelation of secrets that had been festering beneath the surface for decades. The fallout lasted for months. Some family members stopped speaking to each other, alliances were formed, and a cold war of sorts gripped our once tight-knit group. The DNA test eventually confirmed my grandmother's worst fears, but by then, the damage had already been done. The Christmas that had started with laughter and love had ended in heartbreak and division, and no amount of holiday cheer could ever patch the wounds left behind. When I tried to mediate a dispute between friends, I didn't expect it to shatter the very foundation of my reality. Let me explain. For years, I watched my friends, Alex and Sarah, build an unshakable bond, one that many would envy. They were inseparable, always sharing laughter, surviving heartbreaks together, and dreaming about the future. But like any relationship, cracks began to form. It started with a simple disagreement over an inside joke, something trivial that should have been resolved over a quick phone call, yet spiraled into a rift that grew wider with each passing day. As weeks turned into months, I found myself caught in the middle, going to one side and then the other, trying to apply the soothing balm of reason. You have to talk it out, I urged them both. Friendship is too valuable to crumble over misunderstandings. They seemed to listen, but every time I thought they were closing the gap, something new would come up, and that rift would gurgle back to life. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I arranged a gathering at my place and invited them both under the guise of a game night. I figured a relaxed atmosphere would help them remember what they enjoyed about each other, how friendship can sometimes need a little grease to keep from rusting over. I spent hours preparing snacks, arranging chairs in a circle, and setting up a cheerful ambience that I hoped would encourage connection instead of conflict. As the appointed hour drew near, my heart raced. I wanted so badly to see them laughing together again, their shared joy a testament to the strength of their bond. The doorbell finally rang, and I welcomed Alex, his face a storm cloud shadowed by unease. "Hey, man," he said awkwardly, glancing around as if expecting Sarah to emerge from the shadows. Moments later, Sarah arrived, her eyes cool and collected, but the tension crackling around her felt almost palpable. I tried to break the ice, cracking jokes and hoping to elicit a few smiles, but the atmosphere remained frigid. After a brief round of board games that lasted just long enough to convince them that we were having fun, I could see their patience waning. I called for a break and led them into the living room, where the coffee table bore the remnants of snacks. In that still moment, I summoned all my courage. "We need to talk, the three of us," I said, my voice steady but my heart quickening. They exchanged glances, defensive, hesitant, and recognizing their silent agreement to avoid confrontation. "Why don't we discuss what happened?" I ventured, feeling my palms sweat. "It's time to clear the air." For a moment, silence draped over us, only interrupted by the soft ticking of the wall clock, each tick like a pulse, reminding me that time was running out. And then, something shifted in the air. I didn't notice it at first, but it was as if the room grew dimmer, shadows stretching longer, and then I heard it, a sound, like a whisper carried on a cold draft. A voice I couldn't identify, but it chilled me to the bone. "Stop," it seemed to hiss. I jerked my head toward the windows, expecting to see the streetlights flickering outside. Nothing. I brushed it off as a trick of the mind, too preoccupied with Alex's sudden flare of anger as he threw out accusations and defended his position on the joke that had started their feud. Sarah countered back, her voice rising, and suddenly we were engulfed in a vortex of tension. My attempts to interject fell flat, muffled by their escalating emotions. And then it spoke again, louder, more insistent. "Stop this." I froze, glancing at both of them as they continued, lost in the heat of their argument, oblivious to the presence looming over us. That's when I noticed the shadows, creeping like tendrils across the walls, seeming to pulse with an energy all their own. My heart dropped. I dared not reveal my fear, my instincts screaming at me to end this confrontation, but I had invited them over to find resolution, not fear. And just when I opened my mouth to intervene, a whisper slithered right into my ear, like icy fingers trailing down my skin. "You shouldn't have done this," it warned. Panic seized me, but I couldn't let it show. I had to focus on Alex and Sarah. Just then, Sarah's voice took on an otherworldly resonance, a deep, echoing timbre that made my skin crawl. "You think you can fix this?" She spat, her eyes wide with an intensity I had never seen before. "You think your little game nights can patch everything? You have no idea what's at stake." I opened my mouth to speak, but no sound came out. Their forms blurred, flickering as though the very fabric of reality was fraying around us. Shadows began swirling, absorbing the light, and suddenly, the warmth of the room turned to a bone-chilling cold. "Get out," Alex barked, the voice now layered with a different timbre, something sinister brewing beneath his familiar facade. "You have no power here." I stumbled backward, caught between two friends who were no longer recognizable, their faces distorting, contorting into grotesque masks devoid of the love and laughter that had once filled the room. I turned to flee, but something tugged at my leg, a dark mass rising from the floor, wrapping around my ankles, constricting like a vice. "You wanted to meddle," it hissed, echoing the voices of my friends. "Now you will pay the price." I fought against the dark tendrils wrapping tighter, dragging me down, and the last thing I saw was Sarah's face, twisting into a snarl, her eyes glowing, an abyss where warmth used to be. I awoke hours later in my living room, the game night set up all but a memory. The shadows were gone, the atmosphere returned to a mundane reality, but my heart thudded against my ribs in a rhythm of dread. I picked up my phone, hoping to reach out to Alex and Sarah, but I noticed their numbers were gone. Deleted. Panic coursed through me like ice water, my fingers trembled as I scrolled through messages, memories of countless nights shared, but they had all vanished. They were wiped from existence, as if they had never been. I ran out of my apartment, fear propelling me forward into the dimly lit streets, searching, hoping to find a familiar face. I knocked on doors, asking neighbors if they knew where Alex and Sarah lived, but their faces twisted with confusion, they had never heard of them. I fumbled through memories, piecing together fragments, but it was akin to chasing shadows. Hours turned to days, and I found myself grappling with an empty space where friendship once thrived. The laughter, the shared wisdom, the inside jokes, all obliterated by a dispute I never intended to provoke. Something beyond my understanding had taken them, and I was left to bear the burden of my mediating mistake. Now I wander aimlessly, seeking answers in whispers of the dark, dreading the day when I will be pulled into the void that consumed everything I held dear. So heed my warning if you ever find yourself trying to mediate a dispute between friends. Sometimes, the shadows listening behind you are waiting for an invitation. They are all too eager to rip apart the bonds you cherish, to take what you love and twist it into something unrecognizable. Remember, not all disputes should be meddled in, sometimes the cost is far too high. When I helped a family member in need, I never expected it would spiral into something so dark. My cousin Jake always had a knack for getting into trouble. Growing up, it was small things, stealing candy from the corner store or sneaking out late at night. But as we became adults, the trouble he found got much worse. A few months ago, Jake called me late at night, his voice shaky and panicked. He said he was in deep trouble, the kind that could ruin him. I could hear his breathing, rapid and irregular, and my heart began to race. I knew I had to help him, despite the countless times he'd dragged me into his messes before. When I arrived at his apartment, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of unease. The dimly lit space was cluttered with half-eaten takeout and crumpled beer cans. Jake paced back and forth, his hair disheveled and his eyes wide with fear. He finally confessed that he owed money to some dangerous people, loan sharks who wouldn't take kindly to him skipping payments. My gut churned. This wasn't just a financial mess, it was a life or death situation. I knew I had limited options, but I offered to help him find a way out. We spent hours brainstorming, each idea more ludicrous than the last. I could see Jake's desperation, it made my own stomach twist in knots. I suggested scraping together whatever savings we both had, but we fell short. Eventually, we landed on a plan. I would help him steal from the very people he owed money to. The idea horrified me, but I felt cornered, as if Jake's life depended on it. We decided to break into a warehouse where one of the loan sharks conducted illicit activities. The night we chose was shrouded in fog, adding a layer of creepiness to the whole scenario. Armed with flashlights and an adrenaline-fueled sense of urgency, we approached the old building, its cracked windows gleaming with a foreboding light. The air was thick with tension, every sound amplified by our racing hearts. As we sneaked inside, I felt a chill run down my spine. The place was a labyrinth of dark corners and rusted metal shelves. Jake led the way, whispering directions as we crept stealthily through the aisles. After what felt like an eternity, we found a small room at the back filled with cash and large stacks of illegal items. The sight made my stomach lurch. This was wrong, so very wrong. But desperation clouded my judgment, and we began shoving bundles of cash into our backpacks. Just when we thought we had gotten away with it, a loud crash echoed through the warehouse. My blood ran cold. I turned to Jake, panic etched on his face, and we rushed toward the exit. With every step, I could hear voices approaching us, the heavy sound of footsteps drawing nearer. Just as we reached the door, I felt a hand grip my shoulder, spinning me around. A large man loomed over me, his eyes burning with anger. In that moment, something snapped inside me. I turned to run, dragging Jake with me, my instincts screaming at me to just escape. We darted through the warehouse and out into the night, the adrenaline coursing through my veins. The sound of shouting faded behind us, but I could still feel their eyes on us, the threat of being caught looming heavily in the air. We ran until we were far enough away, finding a dimly lit alley to catch our breath. My heart pounded wildly, each inhale bitter with guilt. We had crossed a line, and deep down, I knew this would catch up to us. In the following days, Jake began acting strangely. He'd jump whenever there was a loud noise, his paranoia growing with each passing moment. I tried to reassure him, but I could feel the tension that had settled between us. One evening, I received a chilling phone call. It was Jake's voice, but something was off, his tone was frantic, almost delirious. He begged for help, claiming he was being watched. The fear in his voice gripped me, and I rushed over without a second thought. When I arrived, the room was dark, filled with a sensation of dread. But Jake was nowhere to be found. I called out to him, my voice echoing against the barren walls. Just then, I noticed his backpack sitting on the ground, the one we used for the heist. I approached it with trepidation, slowly unzipping it, my heart rate accelerating with each passing second. Inside lay the cash we had stolen, but there was something else, a small notebook filled with names and numbers, including those of the people we had stolen from. Panic surged through my chest as I realized what we had stumbled into, a web far darker than I could have ever imagined, where our actions would reverberate through sinister circles. Just as I was piecing everything together, the door creaked open slowly, and my blood ran cold. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, someone huge and menacing. Looking for someone? The voice was deep and gravelly. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for an escape route. My heart sank when I realized how badly Jake had screwed us over. He had gotten us into something we couldn't get out of. In a moment of sheer instinct, I bolted for the fire escape. I heard footsteps behind me, but I didn't dare look back. I rushed into the night, my lungs burning as I forced my body to move faster. They followed close behind, and every shadow felt like a predator waiting to pounce. I knew I was on borrowed time, either to save Jake or to escape whatever darkness was now chasing me. It took weeks for the chaos to settle, and during that time, I learned the hard way how deep the rabbit hole went. Jake was never found, lost to the darkness, while I was left haunted by the choices we made. I've since moved away, trying to put this behind me, but the cold whispers of that night stalk me still. Now I keep my doors locked tight, living in fear of shadows lurking outside. But sometimes, late at night, I could swear I still hear him calling for help. I wish I had never answered that phone call, that I had never sat there in that stuffy apartment, but we can't go back. All I can do now is share my story and hope that someone else learns the truth. Sometimes the bonds of family can lead you into the darkest places when all you meant to do was help.